Hey guys, before we start, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment if you have any feedback. Let's go to the story. It's strange how betrayal doesn't hit all at once. It creeps in, piece by piece, twisting the truth until everything you believed in crumbles beneath you. There was a time when I trusted them, my family, my fiancée, the people who were supposed to stand by me. I thought love meant loyalty, that blood meant protection. I learned the hard way that I was wrong. 2 years ago, I stood at the altar, waiting for the woman I loved. The venue was perfect, the guests seated, and the music started. I had pictured this day 1,000 times, but never like this. Never with the growing unease twisting in my gut as the minutes stretched into an eternity. Then came the whispering. It rippled through the room like a slow-moving fire. I saw my mother whisper something to my father. My aunt turned to her husband, eyes widening. My best man checked his phone, his expression darkening. Something was wrong. I felt it before I even reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. One new message. I can't do this. My hands went numb. The world around me blurred. The weight of those 4 words crushed me more than any long-winded explanation ever could. She was gone. My fiancée, the woman who had promised me forever, had vanished. And then, my mother stood. She didn't look surprised. She didn't even look upset. Just resigned. She walked up to me, placed a hand on my shoulder, and in the calmest voice I had ever heard, she said, "It's better this way." Better? I stared at her, waiting for some kind of explanation. Instead, my father walked up beside her, nodding in agreement. "You'll understand one day," he muttered. The whispers in the room grew louder. My best friend looked at me with something between pity and rage, his fist clenched. Someone tried to pull me aside, but I barely heard them. My legs moved on their own, pushing through the crowd as I made my way to the exit. Outside, the cold air did nothing to clear my head. My phone buzzed again. A new message, this time from my brother. "We didn't want you to find out like this." The ground beneath me might as well have cracked open. I scrolled up, rereading those words until they lost meaning. I tried to tell myself there had to be another explanation, something I wasn't seeing. But deep down, I already knew the truth. The betrayal had started long before today. I had just been too blind to see it. I disappeared that night. I left behind everything, my apartment, my job, the life I had spent years building. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to be anywhere but there. In the days that followed, the messages poured in. My brother reached out first, full of justifications and half-baked excuses. I ignored him. My mother sent long, guilt-laced texts, insisting that this was for the best. My father, ever the practical one, kept it brief. "Family is complicated. Come home when you're ready." I never responded. In the end, it was my best friend who helped me pick up the pieces. He offered me a place to stay, no questions asked. I took it. The first night in that unfamiliar apartment, I sat in silence, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. They had planned this. They had known. Not just my fiancé and my brother, but my parents. The people who were supposed to protect me had chosen him over me, had watched as he took the life I was supposed to have, and did nothing. No, worse. They encouraged it. The pain should have been unbearable, but after the initial shock wore off, something else took its place. Resolve. If they wanted me erased, I'd make sure they never got the chance to hurt me again. For 2 years, I built a new life. I worked harder than ever, put all my focus into my career, and cut off every last tie to my past. I changed my number, moved states, and erased them from my world as if they had never existed. And for the first time, I felt free. Then, last week, everything changed. I opened my door, expecting a delivery. Instead, I found her standing there. 2 years. 2 years of silence, and now she was standing in front of me, looking lost, looking like she still had a right to be here. I should have slammed the door in her face. Instead, I stepped aside and let the past walk right back into my life. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the apartment as if searching for some remnant of the life she had left behind. I watched her carefully, waiting for the first lie to spill from her lips. The silence stretched between us, thick with the weight of everything unspoken. She had aged in these 2 years. Or maybe it was just the absence of the illusion I had built around her. I used to see her as radiant, the person I would spend my life with. Now, she was just a stranger in familiar skin. "I made a mistake," she finally said. I almost laughed. 2 years of silence, of wreckage left in her wake, and this was all she had? Which part? I asked, my voice colder than I expected. She flinched. All of it. I leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, waiting. She wanted something from me, otherwise, she wouldn't be here. She had made her choices, and I had been forced to live with them. Now, for some reason, she had come to me. I thought I was doing the right thing, she continued. I thought I loved him. The words should have meant something, but they were empty now. I had already lived through the worst of it. Her explanations were nothing but an afterthought. I didn't respond. She hesitated. It didn't work out. I finally let out a bitter chuckle. And now you're here. She nodded, her eyes pleading for something I refused to give. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to see you. I watched her, unmoved. She didn't look like someone who had come for closure. She looked like someone who had nowhere else to go. And I refused to be her backup plan. I don't care, I said finally. She blinked, caught off guard. I had expected her to cry, to play the same game she always had, make herself the victim, turn her guilt into my responsibility. But she wasn't the only one who had changed. I stopped caring a long time ago, I continued. She swallowed hard. I deserve that. No, she deserved much worse. But I wasn't going to be the one to give it to her. The moment stretched, heavy with words unsaid. Then, finally, she nodded and walked toward the door. She paused before stepping out, waiting, hoping for me to say something. I didn't. And just like that, she was gone. I thought that was the end of it, that I had finally buried the past where it belonged. But I had forgotten one crucial thing: people like her never show up alone. Because the next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I never thought I'd see again. My brother. And the past? It wasn't done with me yet. I didn't answer right away. His name on my screen sent a rush of anger through me, but it was distant now, muted by time. I had expected him to reach out eventually. People like him always did. They thought distance was enough to erase betrayal, that time diluted consequences. I opened the message. We need to talk. 2 years. 2 years of silence, of pretending I didn't exist. Now, suddenly, it was we again. I almost ignored it. But curiosity won. I replied with one word. Why? His response came quickly, too quickly. It's about Mom and Dad. I should have known. When people like Nathan had nothing left, they used family as leverage. The same family that had stood by and watched as he ripped my life apart. The same parents who had sided with him told me it was for the best, and acted as though I had been nothing more than an obstacle in his way. I didn't care. I wasn't going back. But something in me needed to know why now. I agreed to meet him. The diner was the kind of place that hadn't changed in 50 years, sticky booths, cracked linoleum, the faint smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air. He was already sitting in the corner when I arrived, shoulders tense, hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. For a moment, I just stood there, taking him in. He looked different. He had always been the confident one, the golden child, the one who walked into a room expecting the world to bend around him. But now, there was something off. Something tired in the way he held himself. I sat down across from him. He looked up and hesitated. Then, you look good. I didn't respond. His smile faltered, and he sighed. I deserve that. I leaned back in the booth, crossing my arms. Just say what you need to say. He hesitated again, like he was choosing his words carefully. Mom and Dad, they're struggling. A humorless chuckle slipped from my lips. And that's my problem because? His jaw tightened. I know you're still angry. Angry. As if this was a petty grudge. As if he hadn't torn my life apart and expected me to just move on like it never happened. They miss you, he continued. They regret how things happened. I tilted my head, watching him. Regret. I repeated, my voice unreadable. He nodded. Yeah, they regret losing me, or they regret losing their control over me? He flinched but didn't argue. That was the answer enough. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I wasn't falling for this. If they missed me so much, they would have reached out themselves. If they had truly regretted anything, they wouldn't have let 2 years go by without a word. Nathan swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the cup. Things didn't turn out how I thought they would. A small, bitter smirk tugged at the corner of my lips. Let me guess, I said. She left you. His silence confirmed it. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. I'm not your second choice, Nathan. I'm not your family's backup plan. You made your choice. Live with it. He looked at me then, really looked at me, like he was seeing me for the first time. You really don't care anymore, do you? And for the first time, I realized I didn't. Not in the way I once had. Once upon a time, I would have killed for an apology, for any acknowledgement that what they did to me was wrong. But now, it didn't matter. Nothing they said could undo what had already been done. I stood up. Goodbye, Nathan. I didn't wait for his response. I just walked away. I thought that was the end of it, that after shutting him down, he would finally leave me alone. But what I didn't realize was that he wasn't the one I should have been worried about. What when desperation takes over? People will do anything to get what they want. I thought shutting Nathan down would be enough. Once he saw I wasn't interested, he'd walk away and take my parents with him. I had underestimated just how desperate they were. They weren't giving up. They were changing tactics. The first sign came 2 days later. A number I didn't recognize lit up my phone. I ignored it. Then another. And another. Each call went straight to voicemail, filling up my inbox with messages I had no intention of listening to. Then, an email. Not from Nathan. Not from my parents. From their lawyer. I sat in silence, reading the subject line over and over again, feeling something ice-cold settle in my stomach. Notice of family dispute resolution. They were coming after me legally. I opened the email and scanned the contents. A request for mediation. A formal request for reconciliation. They were trying to make this look official. At first, I thought it was about money. But the more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't about finances. It wasn't even about guilt. It was about control. A formal, legal way to drag me back into their world. I should have been furious. Instead, I felt nothing. Just exhaustion. I forwarded the email to my lawyer. His response was almost immediate. They have no case. You're under no obligation to meet with them. I'll handle it. That should have been the end of it. But people like them don't just stop when they lose. They double down. A week later, I got another call. This time, from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, my uncle. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity got the better of me. The second I picked up, he sighed. You really did it, huh? I frowned. Did what? Cut them off for good. I exhaled sharply. I did what I had to. He let out a low chuckle. Well, you're braver than me. I didn't respond. After a long pause, his tone shifted. They're falling apart without you, you know. I shook my head. No, they're falling apart because they made their mess. Another silence. Then, they won't stop. I know. Be careful. And then he hung up. I stared at the screen, unease creeping into my bones. They weren't done. Not by a long shot. The next morning, I found out just how far they were willing to go. My landlord knocked on my door, looking uncomfortable. I got a call, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Your parents were asking about your lease. I felt my jaw tighten. What? They wanted to know if you were renewing. If you were stable. I laughed, sharp and humorless. They're trying to make it look like I can't take care of myself. His expression turned sympathetic. That's what I figured. Don't worry, I told them nothing. I nodded, but the unease wouldn't go away. This wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't even about getting me back. They wanted to destroy me. And I had a feeling they weren't finished yet. I changed my number. Blocked every last one of them. Cut off every possible way they could reach me. It should have been enough. It wasn't. Because when manipulation and guilt didn't work, they turned to outright sabotage. I didn't see it coming. Not until I walked into work and found my boss waiting for me, arms crossed, face unreadable. Can we talk? I followed him into his office, heart pounding. I had been with this company for 1.5 years. I worked hard, stayed out of office politics, and never gave anyone a reason to doubt me. So when he shut the door and said, "Someone's been making accusations against you," my stomach dropped. I barely heard the rest. Something about calls made to HR, claims that I had mishandled funds, that I had fabricated parts of my resume. All lies. And I knew exactly where they had come from. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. Do you believe them? He gave me a long look. No. Relief flooded my chest. But I need to ask, do you know who would do this? I met his gaze. Yeah, I do. I spent the next hour with HR, going over every ridiculous claim, shutting down each one with receipts, emails, and contracts. By the time I was done, the case was dead. But it wasn't over. Because my parents had just crossed a line they couldn't come back from. And I wasn't about to let them get away with it. I called my lawyer. This is harassment, I said, pacing the length of my apartment. They've gone from stalking my landlord to trying to ruin my career. I want this stopped. He was already ahead of me. We have enough to file a restraining order, he said. If they violate it, we can escalate to civil action. I didn't hesitate. Do it. The moment the papers were served, the silence was immediate. No more calls. No more fake accusations. They had finally realized they had lost. I should have felt victorious. But I knew them. Knew how their minds worked. And I had a feeling they weren't done just yet. Because when people like them run out of options, they do something reckless. And this time, they were about to make their biggest mistake yet. For the first time in years, there was silence. No calls. No emails. No interference. The restraining order had done its job, cutting off their last method of control. But I knew them too well to believe they'd just accept defeat. People like them don't stop. They just change their strategy. And I was right. 2 weeks later, I got a call from someone I never expected. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer. "Hey, is this?" The voice hesitated before saying my name, unsure. I frowned. "Yeah, who's this?" "This is James. I'm dating Alexandra." I felt my stomach tighten. I hadn't heard her name since she showed up at my door. I thought she had finally crawled back into whatever mess she had made for herself. I stayed silent, waiting for him to explain. "I know this is weird, but I think you need to know what's going on." My grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. "She's been talking to your parents. A lot. And I don't think it's about reconnecting." I ran a hand over my face, exhaling slowly. "Go on." Over the next 10 minutes, James laid it all out. Alexandra had spiraled after I shut her out. Nathan was out of the picture, no surprise there. But instead of moving on, she had gone back to my parents. And they had welcomed her. Because of course, they had. She was their perfect narrative. The woman they had once deemed too good for me had come crawling back. And they were using her for one final attempt to drag me back in. James had found messages on her phone, ones she hadn't meant for him to see. Messages between her and my mother, strategizing on how to fix the situation. Except their version of fixing meant cornering me, forcing a confrontation. A final, desperate push to get me back under their control. I shook my head, anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Why are you telling me this?" James hesitated. "Because I don't think she cares about me. I think I was just a placeholder while she figured out how to get to you. And I'm not interested in playing that game." For a moment, I almost felt bad for him. But mostly, I just felt tired. This was their final move. A desperate, last-ditch effort. And I was about to shut it down for good. The next day, I sent one final legal order. A permanent no-contact directive. Not just for my parents. For all of them. Alexandra included. The moment it was served, I got a single, short message from my mother. "You've made your choice. Don't expect to be part of this family again." I smiled. That was the point. The moment the no-contact order was served, I knew it was over. Not because they had finally understood, not because they felt remorse, but because they had no other choice. Their games, their manipulation, their attempts to rewrite history, none of it worked anymore. I had one. I was free. I expected one final message, one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. My mother never could accept being powerless. And right on cue, she sent it. A single, hollow warning. "You've made your choice. Don't expect to be part of this family again." I stared at the words, letting them sink in. Years ago, a message like that would have crushed me. I would have spent nights overanalyzing it, wondering if I was making a mistake. But now? Now, it felt like a relief. Because I wasn't part of their family. Not really. I never had been. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. No calls. No emails. No more flying monkeys trying to drag me back. I had cut out the disease, and for the first time, my life was mine. I threw myself into work, into my passions, into building something for myself that had nothing to do with them. And the best part? They got to watch. They got to see the life they tried to ruin flourish without them. They had spent years convincing me that I was nothing without them, but I had never needed them at all. Months passed, then a year, then 2. Every once in a while, I'd hear whispers, stories from distant relatives about how things had fallen apart. My parents had lost their influence. Nathan was struggling, caught in the same web of lies they had once built for me. Alexandra? She had disappeared. And me? I was thriving. Without them. Because I had never been the problem. One evening, I sat on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker below. My best friend was beside me, a drink in his hand, laughing at something stupid on his phone. "You ever think about them?" he asked suddenly. I thought about it. I thought about the years I wasted trying to prove myself, the endless cycle of trying to be good enough for people who had already decided I never would be. I took a slow sip of my drink, then shook my head. Not anymore. And for the first time in my life, I truly meant it.